In this video I'm going to be making a matched set of performance hybrid whips out of 550 parachute cord. This is my first time making performance hybrid whips, but the general idea is that instead of being rigidly attached to the handle or using a keeper loop like you'd find in a stock whip, the thong of the performance hybrid whip sits into a recess into the handle and is tied on with two strands coming from the base of the thong, similar to a Florida cow whip. So what I'm making here is effectively like making a snake whip, a lot like this one I made about a year ago, but replacing the heel knot with the two strands I'll use to attach the thong to the handle. I've already gone ahead and cut the strands I'm using, and I've prepared two cores by replacing the inner strands of the core with some lengths of ball chain, just to give the whip a bit of extra weight. Then I've wrapped the entire core with a layer of hockey tape, just to act as a webbing between the core and the first plated belly. The strand lengths I'm using here are adapted from the ones I use to make my snake whips, which are 3 foot long, so I just multiply each strand length by a factor of 5/3 to get the lengths I need for a 5 foot snake whip. So I've gone and completed the first plated belly for one of the whips, and I'll show you how I did that in a minute, but you can see I've got the two strands that I'm going to need later to attach the thong onto the handle of the whip. So the way I've started that is just by taking a 6 foot length of gutted parachute cord, and I'm going to take the strands I'm using for the first belly, so that's, in this case, that's two, I think they're 8 foot strands, and threading them through the loop that I've created by clamping this 6 foot strand onto the table. And I'm going to thread them through until I get to the middle of each strand, just to make sure I've got an even length on both sides. And now I'm going to start my my 4-plait pattern. So that's under 1 over 1, so around the back, under 1 over 1, and I'm going to do one pass of that. So that's just under 1 over 1 with the dark blue, and then under 1 over 1 with the light blue. So now I've started that, but it hasn't really, you can't see much of a pattern there because there's only one pass. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my core for my second whip and put that in between the strands now, so that they can hold that, hopefully hold that nice and central, and then tighten the strands around it. Just pull tight on each end. So that should hopefully, while I continue this 4-plait pattern, hold in my core. And if I zoom in a bit, so now I can continue just plaiting along the length of the core, and that gives me my two strands at the end, which will hopefully be there until I've finished the entire whip. Okay, so just done so you can see there, if I unclamp that and zoom out, what I end up with is my two strands, and that should be nice and securely attached to the core of the whip. So now I just need to plait along with the entire length of the whip until I run out of length in these two strands. So here I'm almost at the end of the plaiting that I'm doing for the first belly, and at this point since I'm making a matched pair, I want everything to be as close as it can be on the two whips. So I'm seeing where I've ended the plaiting, and I think it's about an inch from where I am now on the previous belly, on the previous whip. So I'm going to do maybe 2 or 3 more passes, and then I'm going to start to taper off my strands and get ready to finish this belly. Now I should say that I'm very much a beginner to whip making. I'm not the best platter, and I haven't made that many whips, but I've managed to keep the plaiting on this one straight. This is by no means a tutorial. This is not saying how it should be done. I'm just kind of documenting how I've gone about making a performance hybrid whip. Just since I haven't really been able to find that much information on how they're made, if it's any different to making a snake whip, or particularly the thing that I haven't been able to find any information on is the starting of the whip and how to make that look neat and polished. So maybe I'm not looking hard enough. So I've got to where I want to be, and I'm going to do this the same as I've done on the snake whip. I'm just gonna tape this with hockey tape for the moment to stop it from unraveling while I cut the strands to length. And so I've been, particularly as I approach the area where I'm going to start cutting off the strands, I haven't been plating really tightly. I want this to be a nice smooth transition, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to taper the cut. So I'm cutting at an angle and snipping at an angle and cutting these strands to different lengths. So that way I should hopefully get a nice smooth transition where there's not suddenly a big drop off in diameter or stiffness in the whip, because that's going to end up with a whip that doesn't perform as well. I'm also not heat sealing the ends of these strands as I'm cutting them off, because what I don't want is lumps and bumps underneath my binding or underneath the next layer, because all the mistakes that I make now are only going to be amplified when I go on to the next belly and start plating that. I'm going to start putting a layer of hockey tape just to give the artificial sinew something to grip onto when I start binding this belly. So, in fact, yeah, I'm gonna put the hockey tape on, then I'm going to roll both of these whips. And as I go through each stage, you'll see that I'm not making one whip completely and then making the other whip. I'm doing one step at a time on each whip, so that hopefully I get the most consistency that I can. I'm constantly making comparisons to the last whip and seeing how I can make them more and more similar as I go along. After looking back at some of the footage, I can see that it's getting a bit dark, so I've started to turn my flash on for a bit more light. So now it's time to, now I've rolled the whips and it's time to start binding. This is some artificial sinew that I just got. I got a lot of this stuff on eBay, and except for the parachute cord. If you're in the UK, then I think a good place to get paracord is the Bushcraft store. If you just look up Bushcraft store online, you get a website for a place in Hertfordshire that sells it. That they also sell it online, and but I think if you're in the US, then there is a website called Whip Nation, and they do all sorts of whip making supplies, so that's very useful. But all this stuff I got either on eBay or paracord I got at the Bushcraft store. So I'm just doing a crisscross pattern. I'm not pulling too tightly, but I'm going to be pulling more tightly towards the handle ends, slightly less so towards where I'm finishing my binding. So what I'm doing now is I've got about a hand span along the whip, and now I'm just going back to the start, taking slightly bigger gaps so that I'm not spending lots of time going back, but in doing so I'm going to try and even out any of the places where I feel like it's not been quite as even as it could be. I'm just trying to take care to get just an even coverage and an even tension. Okay, so here I've got back to the start, and you can see that it's a bit more even now, this binding, and I'm actually going to go up again and go a bit further this time. That way my outermost layer is always the longest, and inside I'll have stages. I'll have stages of different thickness. Again, this is going to be a recurring theme of tapering things, and actually this time, since this cross pattern is very time consuming, and it's uses quite a lot of the artificial sinew, I'm going to just spiral up, and then since I'm coming back down, spiral down again, and I'm going to see how that works out for this belly. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at how this has turned out. So my only question is how smooth is that transition going to be between these crisscrosses and these not crisscrosses. Ironically, these look more crisscrossed than the crisscrosses. That's currently looking not too bad. I'll just need to be careful that I don't emphasize that transition, that harsh transition, too much. And again, to be consistent and to make sure that I do the same on the next whip. So now I'm going even further. if anyone out there who has any experience making whips or binding whips, please do let me know if there's any top tips you might have, or just thoughts on how you like to bind your whips, because this is, for me, it's all about improving my method and just learning what I can about what works and what doesn't. So after that, I've got a whip which is bound and hasn't got loads of big kinks in it. So now time to roll it again, and then it'll be onto the next belly. Okay, so I've finished the binding on both my whips, and I've rolled them both. Now I've got one of them clamped up here, and I've put a small piece of hockey tape around the top just to give the strands of the second belly, which I'm about to move on to now, something to grip onto. So I've marked all my strands in the middle just with a pen so that I can keep track of where the middle is. And I've got the shortest strand here because remember on the last whip we started with the shortest strand at the top. And I've got right going over left. Now I'm going to load up the second piece, so that goes on top of the first strand, so on top of the topmost strand, and it goes, the left hand side goes round the back and under the other strand, so under one, over one. So move this up just a little bit. Tighten up both my strands. Okay, now third strand, just going to find my middle. Find my mark that I've made. And so that goes on top of the topmost strand at the bottom. And then going up to the left, I'm going to put it underneath that top strand on the left, round the back, and then it's going to go over one, under one, and over one. So we're going into a checkerboard pattern here, and then it goes over. So you can see here where we're setting up for our checkerboard pattern, and we've got one strand left. So once again, we've got our middle, that goes over this strand at the bottom, and then going up the left, we go under one, oh wait, no, sorry. Yeah, we go under one, then over one, round the back, and here we've got all of our strands here. We can go under one, over one, under one, and over one. So now we are completely set up for our checkerboard pattern. We've effectively done our first pass of that, so let's just even everything out around here. And now with the checkerboard pattern, it's very easy. On my last whip I found it was very easy to confuse which strand is at the top. So for the strand that I'm about to plait, that's going to be on top, and it's just gone over one and then, sorry, it's just gone under one and then over one. So that's going to come around the back, because, so a way to find which strand you need to plait next is or which side you need to plait next, is the bottom strand will be pointing to the side that you're going to go to next. So this strand is going to come around, and this is where it's easy to mess up. So before, a couple of times I messed up by thinking that this was the strand at the top. It's not. This strand behind it is. So my strand comes round and under one, over one, under one, over one. Pull everything tight. And so I'm going to do about 1.5 to 2 inches of this this checkerboard pattern, and once we've done that, we can move on to the next, to the herringbone pattern. One, so under one, over one, under one, over one. Now what I've got here is my 2 strands coming out, and this should hopefully, I'm going to add a bit of hockey tape there at the end just to thicken that up slightly, so that I end up with a sort of a reasonably squared off end like I have on the other whip, and that way when I fit it into the handle, it should sit nicely. Like I say, I haven't made performance hybrid whips before, so I don't know if this is how they are usually made, or if this is how other similar whips, things like Florida cow whips, are made. But I think this looks fairly neat and tidy so far, and so long as it's sturdy and so long as it's neat and tidy, I'm happy with that. Okay, so I've already dropped 1 strand in my second belly, and I need to drop another. So what I'm going to do, I've got it down to the length I want it. I've got about 1 inch left to go, so I'm not going to be able to make another pass with it really, and so I'm just going to start plaiting over it with the other strands. So since I've dropped 1 strand, I've got an uneven number, unbalanced sides, that is. So I'm plaiting on one side, I'm plaiting under 2 over 2, on the other side I'm plaiting under 2 over 1, and so here I've plaited over it and plaited over the strand I want to drop, but there's no strands underneath it, so it can still come alongside. I can still pull it down, so I'm keeping my thumbnail on the part that I don't want to move, part on the main bit of the belly. You saw it moved a little bit, but I can pull on the strand underneath it just to keep it in line and to stop it from moving too much. So now that I've pulled it down, I can continue plaiting. So now I'm plaiting under 2 over 1 on each side. So I'm tightening up the strands around the strand that I've dropped, and I can just leave that in the middle there and continue plaiting over it, and there won't be an issue. This is the same way that I'm going to be dropping strands on the overlay. Now I could, and this is the way I've seen it done and the way I've done it in the past, I could have just left it out there and just continued plaiting and ignored the strand that I want to drop, without going through this whole thing of pulling it underneath and making sure that no bits have moved and making sure that it still looks neat along the length, and then just cut it off, singe it and press it into the thong of the whip. But I'm choosing to do it this way so that hopefully I get a slightly smoother transition. I don't know if it will actually make a difference, but I quite like the way it looks, and it's something that I think is good to practice, since I want to make my whips as polished as I can make them, and the more practice I get at dropping strands, and the more practice I get at making everything look neat and tidy, the better the whips are going to turn out, hopefully. So now I just continue plaiting until I need to drop another strand. The next strand I'm going to need to drop is, I think, one of these light blue strands here. And when I'm plaiting, I'm trying to, I think the phrase is pull tight and plait loose. So I'm not holding them really tight, or I'm trying not to hold them really tight when I'm plaiting, but when I pull them, I'm pulling them, and I'm just keeping hopefully roughly the same amount of tension on all of the pieces that I'm plaiting. I've finished the binding on both of the whips. I've just given them a roll and added a little bit of hockey tape up at the top, just to even out the diameter of the whip, ready for the 12 plait overlay. So I'm going to set this up the same way as I set up the last belly, just one strand at a time. I've marked the middles, and I'm going to get the longest strand at the top this time. So then the second strand goes on top. Of the left-hand strand. Around the back, under the top strand on the right, and over the bottom strand on the right. Make sure I'm not getting tangled up here. Okay. And then on top of the bottommost strand on the left, then under one, round the back, over, under, over. Okay, I'm just going to take some time to make sure that this is arranged as I want it to be before I add the next strand. Okay, so next strand goes, again I'm starting over the bottom left strand, under one, over one, round the back, then under, over, under, over. Okay, now if for the last belly this is where we stopped because we only had 4 pieces to set up. I'm going to continue since we're doing 12 plat for the overlay. So next strand goes over, under, over, under on the left hand side, goes round the back, and it goes over, under, over, under, and over. And now our last strand, final strand, goes over on the left, under, over, under, over, round the back, and under, over, under, over, under, over. Okay. And that is us set up for the checkerboard pattern. And all I need to do now is just even that up so that it's the same the whole way around. And so that I've got the spacing that I want. The sort of shape that I want to start off with. And then I just start plaiting as I would for the checkerboard pattern, starting at the top, starting with just an over, under, or sorry, under, over, under, over. So that goes under, oh, it goes, well, I've lost a couple strands around the back. Here they are. Okay. So yeah, my first strand is up here. That goes under, over, under, over, under, over. So it's just alternating between under and over. Same as before. Doesn't matter how many strands there are, it's going to stay the same. So now I've got to the point where you can see I've done 3 passes of 3 complete passes with the checkerboard pattern, and I'm ready to go on to the herringbone pattern, same as I've done for all of the bellies so far. I'm just going to go straight into that, doing under 3, over 3. Okay, so I'm at the end of my whip now, and I've dropped down to 3 strands. I'm going to do a 3-point full hitch. I've got my fall here, which is just a piece of paracord I've gutted and taken the ends, threaded it through the inside of the strand, and that creates a nice eye that I've looped onto the whip just behind where my ends are. So the core ended up being too long. The plaiting fell short of the length that I was originally intending, but that's not too much of a problem, so long as the two whips have come out the same, which I've measured and they have, so it's okay. I'm going to start with my shortest strand to tie a knot in, and this core I'm just going to snip off afterwards. I've laid my fall underneath where I'm tying all these knots, and I'm just giving my plaiting one last pull tight to make sure that nothing's going to come undone while I'm tying this knot. So just tighten up that eye on my fall and get it a bit closer. Okay, I'm wrapping round the back and through the loop that I've just created. So just a half hitch with each strands, and I'm just laying that alongside the fall now once I've tied the knot, and tying it around the back in the direction that it is being plaited. And I'm not tying these too tightly at the moment because they're going to be loosened up a little bit at the end when I thread the last strand through them to lock the whole thing in place. The last strands which I've left this is the longest. That's being tied around everything, and this one I can tie really tightly as it can go. And then once that is tightened, I'm going to take this nail that I'm using as a makeshift fid. You can use a lacing needle for this and it will be a bit quicker, but I'm going to just use this to help me thread this this end of the last strand underneath the previous half hitches that we've tied, and then giving the full one last tug, and that is my full hitch. So now I'm just going to clip off the end of my core that I didn't need. I'll leave a little bit of it sticking out the ends, which I'm just going to seal in a minute. And this strand here that's pointing backwards, I can cut that short and then just melt it and press it into the body of the whip. But that is it finished, and I can attach a cracker on the end here. So now that I have given the whip a roll, it's time to add a handle. For that I am using just a piece of broom handle, which I've taken the end and just sanded it slightly and added some hockey tape that will become will become apparent why we need that in a minute, or why it's useful in a minute. I've also got a piece of pipe with a diameter that fits nice and snugly over the bottom of the whip. So I've drilled a hole in the bottom about half a centimetre up from the bottom, and there is a matching divot, not a divot, but a recess carved into the end of this handle. So when I add the pipe to the handle, we've got a recess into the end and somewhere that leads out of that recess where we can tie the strands around this bit of the handle. So at the moment I'm just choosing to have just a pressure fit on between the pipe and the handle. I might, if this proves to be not sturdy enough, just glue it in place, or maybe add some sort of pin through the side, but that is undecided yet. I will also be sanding the end of the handle and making it just nicer to hold. So now that I've got this as straight as I think I can get it, time to add the whip. So I'm just going to take my two strands that are being used as anchorage, and thread them, or try and thread them, through this hole. Okay. Now I can put the whip into the recess in the handle and get that nice and tight so that it can't move up and down any more than maybe 1/8 of an inch. Well, that's a centimetre. Well, not a centimetre, what am I talking about? I can't do the conversion in my head. So in order to tie this on, I'm just going to do half hitches round the whip. So I am with one, since these are the same colour, I'm using one to do half hitches until that one runs out. Then I will continue with the other. So just round the back and through the loop that is created. So I will carry that on until I run out of cord, and it looks something like this. And so the handle can swivel independently of the whip, but the whip can't move in and out. And so that's what hopefully I will end up with in this whip as well.